Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome. Today we're diving into a really pivotal time for Japan, the years right after World War I.
Yeah, it's crucial stuff, especially if you're starting to explore Japanese history.
Yeah.
This whole shift towards, well, international cooperation.
Exactly. We'll unpack the big events, the key agreements that really reshaped Japan's place in the world.
And there were some surprising turns, lots of ambition, but also, quite a bit of tension bubbling under the surface.
Let's kick off right at the end of World War I. Germany's defeated.
Right, and the United States played a pretty big role in that final stage.
And then you have President Wilson from the U.S. putting forward his 14 points. What was the main idea there?
Well, the 14 points were basically Wilson's vision for a lasting peace, a framework for how things should work after the war.
So kind of a blueprint for the Paris Peace Conference in 1919?
Precisely. That's where the Allied victors got together to sort out the peace terms with Germany.
And Japan was there, in Paris.
Oh, yes. Japan sent a delegation. Saionji Kinmochi was a key figure representing Japan.
Wilson also talked a lot about national self-determination. What did that actually mean back then?
Well, in Europe, it meant redrawing borders, creating new countries based on nationality, especially in Eastern Europe. The idea was groups should govern themselves.
But it wasn't applied everywhere, was it?
No, not really. That's the key thing. It was mostly a European focus, which, showed the limits of the idea and caused resentment elsewhere.
Like in Korea, that seems like a stark example.
Absolutely. You had the March 1st movement in 1919, Koreans demanding independence from Japan.
And the response?
It was suppressed. The Japanese military put it down quite forcefully. It really highlighted the gap between the ideals talked about in Europe and the reality of colonial rule.
Okay, so Japan's at the conference. What did they actually get out of it? What were the gains?
Well, Japan did get a couple of significant things. They inherited Germany's former rights in the Shandong Peninsula in China.
Right.
And they were given a mandate under the new League of Nations to administer Germany's old island territories in the South Pacific, the ones north of the equator. Saipan, for instance.
Sounds like a win for Japan, but I guess not everyone was happy.
Definitely not. China was strongly opposed to Japan getting Shandong. Very strongly.
And that led to?
The May 4th movement in China. A huge wave of anti-Japanese nationalist protests. It really shows that early friction.
Japan also tried to get something else included in the treaty, didn't they? Something about race.
They did. They proposed a clause on racial equality.
How did that go down?
It was rejected.
Yeah.
Powers like the U.S., Britain, they blocked it.
That was a stung.
Oh, absolutely. It was a clear signal, really, about the existing power dynamics and racial hierarchies. It probably fed into this feeling that Japan wasn't quite seen as an equal by the West.
So the big outcome is the Treaty of Versailles. Reshapes Europe, creates this Versailles system.
Yes, sets up that new order in Europe, new borders, reparations for Germany, the whole thing.
And crucially, it leads to the League of Nations.
Yeah. Exactly. Established in 1920, the first permanent international organization designed specifically to maintain peace. A huge step, in theory.
And Japan wasn't just in it. They were a major player from the start.
That's right. Japan was one of the 4 permanent members of the League's council, alongside Britain, France, and Italy.
Yeah.
It really marked Japan's arrival as a top-tier global power.
But ironically, the country whose president pushed hardest for the League,
the
U.S.,
never actually joined. Yeah, it's one of history's great ironies.
Yeah.
The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty.
Wow. So the U.S. is out, but still cooperating sometimes.
Yeah, they weren't members, but they did engage with the League on certain issues. Still, their absence definitely weakened the whole structure from the beginning.
So Japan's in this powerful position in the League. How did that play out? What was their standing sort of internationally?
It was complex. On one hand, they're recognized as a major power alongside the Western nations, but they're also kind of caught in the middle. Between those established Western powers, who were maybe a bit wary of Japan's rise, and other Asian nations, some of which had experienced Japanese expansionism directly. So facing suspicion from multiple directions, really.
Which brings us then to the Washington Conference, just a couple of years later.
Right, 1921, 1922. This time initiated by the United States.
What was the U.S. aiming for?
Well, several things. They wanted to head off a potential naval arms race, particularly with Japan and Britain. They also wanted to limit Japan's influence in China and sort of establish a new status quo in East Asia.
And why did Japan agree to go along? What was in it for them?
For Japan, it was partly about shoring up the relationship with the U.S., which was becoming really important,
Makes sense.
and also, frankly, the cost. Naval buildups are incredibly expensive, and Japan was feeling the financial strain. Disarmament had its attractions from a budget perspective.
Who are the main Japanese figures at Washington?
Key players were the naval minister, Kato Tomosabaru, and the ambassador to the U.S., Shidehara Kijuru. Shidehara especially becomes important later.
Okay, so what came out of the conference? First, there was a four-power treaty.
Yes, 1921, Japan, the U.S., Britain, and France. It was about respecting each other's island possessions in the Pacific, sort of a security agreement.
And importantly,
It meant the end of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which had been around for quite a while, a big shift in alliances.
then the big one, the Washington Naval Treaty. That tackled the arms race head-on.
Directly. Signed in 1922, adding Italy to make 5 powers. They agreed to stop building big capital ships, battle cruisers for 10 years.
And they set limits.
Yes, a ratio for total tonnage of these ships. The U.S. and Britain got 5, Japan got 3, and France and Italy got 1.67, a very concrete limit on naval power.
There was also a 9-power treaty, more countries involved.
Right. This one brought in China, Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal too. It was focused specifically on China.
And what did it say about China?
It affirmed China's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. And importantly, it upheld the idea of the open-door policy, equal opportunity for all nations trading with or investing in China.
So trying to prevent any one power from dominating China.
That was the principle, yes.
And as part of this whole cooperative spirit, Japan agreed to give back Shandong.
They did. They committed to returning the Shandong Peninsula to China, which was a significant gesture aligning with the conference's aims.
And we even have physical evidence of this disarmament. Right, a ship being scrapped.
That's right. The Japanese warship Subaru. It was deliberately sunk in 1924, a direct result of the treaty limits, a very visible symbol of the policy.
So all these treaties together created what's called the Washington System for East Asia. What was the essence of that system?
Essentially, it was an order based on cooperation, mainly between the U.S., Britain, and Japan, an attempt to manage relations and maintain stability in the region through these agreements.
Now, focusing inward on Japan, all this talk of disarmament, limiting the Navy, that must have had ripples within the Japanese military itself.
Oh, definitely. For military personnel, it was a pretty challenging time. Fewer ships, plans for army reductions later.
Right.
It meant fewer opportunities for promotion, maybe even job insecurity.
Did it affect how the military was viewed in society?
There are signs it did. Its social standing seemed to dip a bit. We hear anecdotes, about officers feeling a bit awkward wearing their uniforms in cities. Perhaps a sense that the military wasn't quite as central or prestigious as before.
You mentioned personal stories, too.
Yeah, there are accounts, like an officer whose fiancé broke off their engagement because of the uncertainty around military cutbacks. It shows the very real human cost these big political decisions could have.
So it's understandable that some in the military weren't happy.
Absolutely. Dissatisfaction started to grow, particularly in certain military circles and among nationalist groups. They saw this cooperative diplomacy, this disarmament, as weakness.
Weakness.
Like Japan was bowing to American pressure, giving up its rightful ambitions for expansion in Asia.
And this resentment, it didn't just fade away.
No. It really laid the groundwork for more radical thinking within parts of the military. Factions emerged later that were willing to challenge the civilian government, even through things like terrorism and attempted coups. That discontent was building.
Still, despite that friction, the overall mood of the 1920s internationally and for Japan's government was generally towards cooperation.
Broadly speaking, yes, that was the dominant trend. Japan was playing its part in the League of Nations, trying to operate within this new international framework.
And Shidehara Kyuger, whom you mentioned earlier, he becomes foreign minister. His approach is key here.
Very key. Shidehara diplomacy, as it became known, especially under the Kato Takaaki cabinet, really focused on maintaining good cooperative relations, particularly with the United States.
Japan also formalized relations with a major neighbor during this time.
Yes, the Soviet Union. In 1925, the Japan-Soviet Basic Treaty was signed. Diplomatic relations were established for the first time since the Russian Revolution.
And the policy towards China under Shidehara.
The approach was generally to avoid military intervention. The idea was to protect Japan's interests, the ones based on existing treaties, through diplomacy and negotiation, not force.
And the army saw cuts, too, following the Navy.
Yes, Army disarmament followed the naval treaties. This helped cut military spending quite significantly, which fit with the government's desire for fiscal responsibility.
And how was all this received within Japan generally? Did people support it?
For the most part, yes. Political parties, the business world, major newspapers, they generally back the government's policy of international cooperation and fiscal prudence.
But that opposition from parts of the military and the nationalists, it was still there.
It was always there, simmering beneath the surface. They continued to criticize the government, seeing the U.S. as trying to hold Japan back, seeing cooperation as, well, a sellout.
So as you can see, this really was a complex time for Japan, a balancing act.
Definitely. Emerging as a major world power after the war, actively involved in building this new international system, the League, the treaties.
But at the same time, those very policies of cooperation and disarmament were creating dissent at home, especially within the military.
Exactly. Sowing seeds of internal tension that would, really sprout and have major consequences down the road in Japanese history.
So here's something to think about. How might Japan's experience in the League, the feeling of maybe not being fully equal, plus the limits imposed by Washington, how might all that have influenced Japan's later choices in foreign policy?
Yeah. And what does this period tell us more broadly about, say, the challenges of rising powers, national ambition, and the difficulties of maintaining international cooperation when different interests collide? Lots to mull over there.